Hello and welcome to tonight's Commonwealth Club World Affairs program. My name's Melissa Kane. I'm a political and legal analyst, and I'm your moderator for this evening. Before we begin, the club would like to thank the Civic Health Project for supporting this program. And a few reminders, tonight's program is being recorded, so we kindly ask that you silence your cell phones for the duration. Also, if you have any questions for our guest, please fill them out on the cards there on your seats. And if you're joining us via YouTube, put it right there in the chat. Now it is my pleasure to announce our guest this evening. He's a professor of psychology and neuroscience at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, where he directs the Deepest Beliefs Lab and the Center for the Science of Moral Understanding. Over his academic career, he has published over 120 scientific papers on topics ranging from psychology, politics, religion, to AI. And now he's got a new book, Outraged: Why We Fight About Morality and Politics and How to Find Common Ground. Everyone, please welcome Dr. Kurt Gray. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for wearing appropriate heart socks for the holiday.
You bet.
Alrighty, so let us begin. Outrage, is that a thing? Do we have that?
I think so.
Tell us about why you wrote the book.
I wrote the book because people are pretty outraged today. I wrote the book because I think we misunderstand how our minds work, and we misunderstand who we are, and that misunderstanding makes it hard for us to feel less outraged and to find common ground with those we disagree with. And so the book's an attempt to kind of set the record right, scientifically speaking, so that we can find common ground with other folks.
And the thesis, if I may take a stab at it, please correct me, is that essentially we're all attempting to avoid harm. And so even people we disagree with aren't necessarily sort of trying to get us or attack us. They're actually trying to avoid their own harm. And so that's sort of the way we should think about these disagreements.
Exactly right. So there's a narrative that's popular in society today. It's called the destruction narrative, I call it at least. And that's the idea that we think the other side's out to destroy us, kind of burn the world down like some Marvel supervillain, right? Just want to like watch the world burn. But in fact, almost no one's like that. Instead, I think the correct narrative is something called the protection narrative, which is that everyone's trying to protect themselves and stand up for those who they see as vulnerable. I think the catch is, though, that people of different parties, of different faiths, sometimes focus on different potential victims. They see different sources of harm, and that's where disagreement comes from. So it's not that people have different moral senses. We all focus on preventing harm, but we just have different assumptions about what causes harm and who needs to be most urgently protected.
And you start the book with a humbling, at least I found it very humbling, thesis that we are not apex predators. In fact, we are basically, evolutionarily speaking, scared bunnies, essentially. And I love it. It's the first sort of third of the book, and it's really, really fascinating. Right.
So there's another misconception, and it's very popular, and it's the idea, I mean, if you watch 2001 Space Odyssey, if you read any of these kind of classic books, right, it suggests that humans are predators. You go to museums, you look at dioramas, there's the hunters with the kind of stone-tipped spears killing mammoths. And we have been apex predators for a little bit of time, evolutionary speaking, but if you look back in the mists of our evolution, 4 million years ago, our ancient hominid ancestors, we were mostly getting eaten. You know, there's this idea of like, you know, we transition as a predator, but if you look at all the anthropological evidence, we never really transitioned until very recently. There's one figure, it's in the book, that I really love. They found a skull of a hominid, and they found 2 holes in the top of it, and they kind of like did some 3D, you know, CSI modeling, and basically found a saber-toothed cat teeth right on top of the skull. So that's basically what we were afraid of all the time. And so feelings of threat are hardwired into our minds. Of course, today we don't fear wild animals as predators so much anymore, but we still fear predators, right? They're just moral predators, right? That white panel van driving around your neighborhood while your kids play. You're not like, oh, I wonder if that's a lost locksmith. No one thinks that, right?
You're on next door, like, everyone look out. Yeah, and you talk about in the book, it's really fascinating because I remember reading about this, the Tong child, where y'all might remember, this is the Commonwealth Club. So we have very, very smart, well-read folks here, who was it's one of the earliest sort of human skulls that has been found. And for the longest time, it was assumed that humans had sort of killed this other human, that it was a sort of maybe even cannibalistic.
Right.
But the reality was way weirder.
Right. So this skull was found in South Africa, and an anthropologist named Raymond Dart discovered it in a box of old bones. He found it. He realized it was a missing link, and the spine was at the bottom, so you knew it was like a human that walked upright instead of coming out of the back, which is where we'd be if it was all fours. And when he looked at it, he realized there were tool marks on the skull. And he thought, well, only humans can use tools, and there's like scraping of flesh off the bones. And so he surmised, I feel like this is a bit of a leap, but he surmised that it was like scraped off the bone by like an uncle maybe of this child. And so, he argued that this is evidence that we're cannibalistic killers. And also maybe, I don't know, get annoyed with children. And then some folks, and so this spawned all sorts of things, like 2001: Space Odyssey, with a scene of like one ape beating another ape with a femur. That's also supposed to be evidence of our predatory nature. Heart of Darkness, all these things. Lord of the Flies, right? So much culture about us as predators. And then some anthropologists came around in the 90s, and they looked at the skull more closely, and they were not totally convinced. And then they looked at some of the other trappings that were found with the bones, and they found eagle egg shells. And they thought, this is so weird. How would like a predatory, cannibalistic human ancestor like spend all this time to like climb on the top of a mountain and like eat little eagle eggs? Like a little omelet with your side of people. And so they surmised it wasn't a discard pile of humans after all. It was just an eagle's nest. And what had happened was the eagle was big enough, because people were smaller then, ancestors were smaller, to just pick up kids as they were outside and take them away to the nest and eat them. So the marks were beak marks of the eagle eating the child.
Like we were eagle food.
Yeah, right?
We weren't.
And even today, you can find videos of harpy eagles picking up like lambs in Asia. And they're plenty big enough to pick up a small child. So don't take your newborn baby on a picnic with you in the steppes. Even today.
In case you were planning that.
Yeah, that's right.
So this idea that we were actually, fairly skittish, our ancestors were, that our brains are really wired to be this way, leads us to have a very sort of normal response, which is to try to avoid that harm, avoid being eaten by an eagle. And then we get to the sort of sapient part where we get to the social brain, as you might call it. And then that creates a whole new incentive for group regulation. You talk a little bit about how we got from eagle food to creating social outcasts and things.
That's right. So like any other prey species, or like many prey mammals, we formed groups. So monkeys form groups, gazelles, all sorts of animals form groups so you can kind of keep out an eye for predators. But living in groups has its own risks, which are other people, right? Once you live in a group with other people, well, they can hurt you, they can beat you, they can steal from you. And so we needed a tool psychologically to help those groups survive over time, cooperate, right, defend against threats. And that psychological tool is morality, right? The sense that we're going to dampen down our own selfish instincts, work together with others to achieve our goals. And so that's where our sense of morality comes from, just like being able to live together. And it's also where our sense of outrage comes from, because when we're confronted with someone perpetrating harm in our groups, right? If like a stranger comes up to you and just hits your kid, you get outraged, right? That's wrong. You're harming someone within my group. And what we do, we send them, far away, we punish them. So all these feelings of outrage have a very functional basis, at least historically. And of course now they're more rampant.
Yeah, and then social media, they're at the end.
That's right.
But you also point out, and it's an important distinction because I do want to talk about what your theory here is in opposition to, and we'll get to that. But I do want to sort of get to if y'all are Kahneman fans, system one brain, which is sort of what some people might jokingly call sort of the reptilian brain, or our sort of Neanderthal brain. And then there's the system two brain, which is the very sophisticated, write long books brain. And that's the one that we also enjoy. But you argue that it all actually comes from the first part of the brain, that there's a very sort of pre-sapien maybe, or pre-modern source of all of this.
Yeah, so our moral sense, I think, is really like a powerful heuristic, an emotional heuristic grounded in our visceral perceptions of harm. And so, when we think about morality and when we think about perceptions of harm, you can think about an actuary, like how dangerous is it to base jump, right? How dangerous is it to build on a floodplain? And then you can think of our sense of morality like maybe a judge kind of weighing the pros and cons. But it turns out that for everyday people, it's not that at all, not our perceptions of harm and not our moral sense. And so when we get this visceral sense that something's harmful in our environment and our society, that visceral sense of harm, especially when it's intentional harm, right? Like when someone is doing something that victimizes someone we care about or who seems vulnerable, that's where we get a visceral sense of moral condemnation, of outrage. And so it's really deep in our gut.
Well, and the reason that's important too is because if somebody's just reacting in a way that they can almost not control, then you have to find maybe some forgiveness. I was reading a book recently where the main character is this wise old man, and he says to the narrator who had just been attacked by a lion, he said, you wouldn't be offended by, you're not mad at the lion for attacking you. The lion's just doing what lions do. So why are you mad at people who make you mad? Because they're just doing what people do, what they sort of have to do based on these impulses. So maybe there's some forgiveness there.
There could be if we don't react as viscerally as we do. And so there's some arguments that we almost want, as a species, moral outrage to be really strong and reflexive and hard to tamp down, because that discourages people from harming us. And so there's all sorts of experiments in this and kind of economic studies, but there's a problem in society. It's called the free rider problem, right? Which is that we all cooperate, we all pay taxes, but sometimes people don't pay their taxes. And if we didn't care about people paying their taxes, then other people would also start not to pay their taxes. And soon, no one would be paying our taxes, and we'd have no money. But it turns out that people get really angry when people are free riders. In fact, they get so angry and outraged, they're willing to pay money to punish those people, even though punishing them doesn't help them in the short term, right? That's outrage. And so that outrage, that sense of I want to punish you because you're just doing a bad thing in society, actually keeps people in line. Right? Just knowing that they could be punished makes people cooperate. And so outrage also serves as kind of cooperative function, at least in these kind of smaller societies. Again, it's not clear it does that on social media or things like this, but again, there's a function here.
Well, and so what's important about sort of talking about this as something that comes from deep within us is because there is this other school of thought. This is the Jonathan Haidt's school of thought, that says that there's something outside of that feeling. There's something outside of that sort of system one sort of override that also exists within us. And you argue that's not true.
Right. So, John Haidt also argues that morality is in general system one, and that's one of his, I think, great insights. But he separates kind of things that are harmful, right? Like a direct physical violence or emotional, insulting someone, making someone sad. And he separates those from other acts that are not tied to harm. Acts of impurity, he might tie to disgust, let's say. So the classic example that he uses is consensual incest between siblings. This
And all of the YouTube viewers just left.
That's right. This is like the most famous example in all of moral psychology. It's like John Haidt's brainchild about Mark and Julie and their brother and sister, and they make love, but everyone has birth control, and they never do again, and they have a great time, and they never tell their parents, etc. So it's this very convoluted scenario that like, no, everything's cool, don't worry about it. And so John would say that this is a harmless act, and people condemn it because of disgust and not because of its harm, right? Because people do condemn it. Newsflash, people think that incest is wrong.
He's laughing because backstage I was like, I have 3 older brothers, and this was so traumatizing to keep, because it comes up a lot, right? So I'm reading, I'm like, please stop talking about it.
You have to engage with the science.
Yeah,
That's all I'm doing.
no, it's fine.
But I think the key thing to remember here is that this understanding of harm is visceral. So John would say the moral judgment's visceral, but harm is not. Harm is reasoned, it's rational. And I think my answer is no, harm is not reasoned or rational, right? Even if I tell you, look, it's totally safe, I tell you, it's totally safe for you to have sex with your brothers. You know?
Trigger warning.
Right, exactly. You will say, no, I do not believe you, right? Because perceptions of harm are so visceral. If the example I really like is there's something called the Grand Canyon Skywalk, and it juts out over the Grand Canyon. And it's transparent. It's very safe. Psychologically, rationally, you know it's safe. But if I find a tourist standing on there, just like sweating and groaning and grabbing their face because they're terrified, I will say, why are you so afraid? And they'll say, well, because I don't want to die. And I say, but you know it's safe. Rationally. And they say, I know that I know, but just viscerally, I just can't believe it, right? And is that so crazy? Because millions of years of evolution have made us terrified of heights and thinking that they're harmful, and so you can't believe it. And millions of years of evolution have made us think that it's wrong to have incest. So there's all these things, all these intuitions that come about harm that come from so long ago that shape our world and our moral views. And they're all about harm, and they're all visceral.
And there is no, what does he say? There is no harmless wrong.
That's right.
Right? Everything that you experience as wrong from deep down is somehow, your brain is calculating that as harmful. Your brain's not saying, it's not harmful, but I still hate it. Your brain is saying, no, this is somehow harmful.
That's right. And of course, morality exists along a continuum, right? So there are things that are very wrong and things that are not at all wrong. And there are things that are very harmful and things that are not at all harmful, right? That involve victimization or not. But those are, this continuum is such that the continuum of our moral judgment, how much we think that something is wrong, is predicted almost perfectly by the continuum of how much we think something victimizes someone else, how much something's harmful. So if you want to know how wrong an act seems to someone, just find out how much they think it's harmful.
To themselves or someone else, right? I mean, you've done a lot of work on how people perceive other people as victims or themselves as victims and how that plays into what they think is moral.
That's right. And often in these kind of scenarios, these studies, it's about perceptions of harming someone else, right? So there's all sorts of things that you could argue are harmless that people actually perceive legitimate harm. And so a real world example is gay marriage. So to moral psychologists, most of whom are liberal or libertarian, right? There's something called the deficit theory of research, that people study things they don't understand. And so
research is me search?
Exactly. So moral psychologists study morality because they don't have any moral convictions, is the argument.
Aren't you a moral psychologist?
And so, gay marriage is not something that moral psychologists think that is immoral, nor that they think it's harmful. And so they're like, well, how can evangelicals, let's say, condemn gay marriage if it's harmless? It must be because God says it's so, or maybe they're disgusted by the idea of gay sex or something like that. But in fact, if you ask an evangelical person who also condemns gay marriage, they will not say it's harmless, right? They will say it's harmful. And so there's a country western singer named Anita Bryant, who was popular back in the day, right? And she wrote a book called The Anita Bryant Story, The Threat of Militant Homosexuality to America's Families, I think it's that. And she basically sacrificed a successful music career to fight against gay rights.
Wait, she had a successful music career?
She had some top 30 hits.
Wow.
She was the face of Florida
shocking.
Orange Juice. That's pretty good.
All right.
You know?
I remember the orange juice thing. Yeah.
But she thought that being gay would somehow destroy American society. And her logic, obviously I don't agree with this, but her logic was something like, kids would be playing at the playground, two gay guys would drive up, dinks, right? Lots of income, no kids, harassing them, they're having a great time. The kids would say, hey, Jimmy, look at how awesome it is to be gay. They're driving a sports car and going to Mallorca. Let's be gay. And then they say, okay, let's be gay, Jimmy. And then they don't have kids. And then the destruction of America. There's like a dotted line there. But right, this is not something that I perceive, obviously, but this is like, and I'm being flip here, but this is kind of like a genuine argument, right? There's a pastor in North Carolina that said failing to ban gay marriage would be the equivalent of a nuclear holocaust. And he was certainly exaggerating, but we've done studies to show that people get like these visceral reactions of harm when they're confronted with things that other people think are harmless.
Well, but what's the limiting principle on something like that, right? Because you could say anything, you can make a harm argument for just about anything, no matter how esoteric. I mean, at some point, and this is the problem, this is, Haidt's issue, as you say, he says at some point, objectively, you're wrong, it's not harmful. And so you move from the sort of visceral to the morality issue. And you say that's not true. But is there any limiting principle? Or we just, your book doesn't argue that all harm is the same, but are there some perceptions of harm that are just too tenuous to take seriously or respect in your opponent?
Well, I think this is what's driving political conflict today, right? The kind of like dismissal of harms that are genuinely perceived on the other side. But to the kind of philosophical claim, well, you could say anything's harmful. I think the important point to make is that I'm not the one saying that this is harmful, right? People are making this claim. I think you could level the same concern of like, well, you're saying that this is immoral, but then is that really immoral? Because I look at it and it's not immoral. So in the same sense, we all agree that morality is a matter of perception. I know Haidt's advisor, Richard Schrader, went to India and found all sorts of rich diversity in people's moral judgments of acts. But underlying that rich diversity of moral acts was a rich diversity in how people made sense of harm. And so if you're a secular atheist, and someone who's religious says, well, this is harmful because it casts your immortal soul into a lake of fire for all time, you might say, well, that's a step too far. I don't believe it. But if they genuinely believe it, then, that's, I think, the issue at hand, that people's worldviews and their separate political bubbles, et cetera, shape so powerfully what they see as harmful and who they see as victims. And that's what's driving disagreement in America today.
Now, you say that there's people's ideas about morality come from various sources, right? It's not just the system one, but it's also lived experience, right? And so if people who have had experiences of trauma often then will either become much more understanding and empathetic or a lot less understanding and empathetic. And I want to dig into that because I think it ties so closely to the social media issue, where you cite some interesting studies that show that people who are in pain right now, in the moment, are, and I'm paraphrasing, mean, and people who are thinking, who are not in pain right now, but who sort of have the time to sort of sit with their system 2 brain and think things through, are a little more generous. But I want you to talk to that, but also about how I feel like maybe social media just kind of keeps us in that pain, right, in that fear place, and so we never get. I don't know about y'all. I feel like I can't breathe sometimes every day. It's just like, what? So, and maybe that sort of is making us harder or meaner to each other. Anyway, I'm sorry for the 9-minute question, but
No, it's a good question. And so to the first point, if you are currently feeling like you're suffering, it's hard to think and take yourself outside of your perspective. So if I ask you to plan for your retirement while sitting, in a pot of boiling water, that's going to be hard for you to do, right? Because you're so fixated on the burning skin, right? You just can't do it. And I think the same thing is true where people feel victimized, right? If you are feeling attacked, if you are feeling hurt, this is why you don't pick an argument with your spouse right after they stub their toe, right? They're like, ow, my toe. And you're like, let's talk about how you were a little mean to me at Thanksgiving. It's not going to go over well because you're so fixated on your pain and suffering. And so if you're fixated on your pain and suffering every day because you're logging on to the internet and things are making you feel really like attacked, then it's hard to have a kind of more open conversation, especially when you think that people on the other side are responsible for that. At the same time, as you mentioned, if you have experienced something, truly terrible, then sometimes it allows you to, and you're not suffering anymore, you can kind of step out of it and kind of think about the complexity of the world and have a sense of understanding. So in the book, I talk about Primo Levi, right, an amazing writer who survived the Holocaust. And he writes about the gray zone when he's thinking of the Jewish folks in the camps who sometimes decided to collaborate with the Nazis to survive and sometimes decided not to. And he tried to resist the kind of, black-white view of morality of those people. He was always like, Nazis are bad, full stop. But the other people, he was trying to make sense of their morality, and he wanted to resist these dichotomies of who was collaborating and who wasn't. And so I think people who have kind of gone through this kind of suffering can realize that other people are trying their best to survive as well, and so shouldn't I have some compassion?
Well, and it goes to some of the findings that you write about with regard to liberals versus conservatives, that there is this, among liberals, there is this, and we're sort of using terms, a little loosely, but that there is this more clear victim-oppressor dichotomy, and that among conservatives, you say it's sort of flattened, and a little bit less of a distinction there, sort of more willing to acknowledge that people can be victims and victimizers at the same time.
Yeah, although it's maybe, I'll just kind of lay it out, kind of how I was thinking of it, right? So no matter if you're leaning left or right, if you've identified someone who you think is a victim, everyone's all in on that victim, right? So it doesn't matter left or right. If you see someone that you think is suffering at work, whatever, in your family, you're like, this is the victim, my cousin's the victim, and my uncle, he's the perpetrator. Everyone kind of splits the world, the moral world, into perpetrator and victim. But there's disagreement on the left and right about generally people's capacity to be victimized. And on the right, folks typically emphasize individual understandings of victimization, individual understandings of potential suffering. So, I think I don't know, Marlboro Man, this kind of rugged individualism, right? But you can also think of everyone who's a human being and born equal in the kind of, I'm not an American initially. I'm a Declaration of Independence or the Bill of Rights or one of these founding documents of America.
Declaration.
That important people wrote. Right, we all have the capacity to suffer. So any one of us, if a knife sliced us, we would bleed the same, right? No matter our race, no matter if we were born rich or poor. And so I think conservatives kind of emphasize this, an individual-based sense of victimization. Progressives, on the other hand, really focus on kind of group identity and your capacity to be victimized as a part of that group. So it's also the case, right, that if you're born poorer or if you're born black instead of white, you're more likely to be victimized, right? That's the case. And so liberals split the world more into kind of groups who are oppressed and groups who are oppressors, whereas conservatives kind of see everyone as not totally equal, but as more equal to suffering. And I think this sheds light on a whole bunch of issues that we're disagreeing about today. So affirmative action, right? If you are a progressive, you say, well, it makes sense because folks from this group have been disadvantaged and they need help to overcome the advantage that the other group faces. But if you're a conservative, you're like, look, everyone has hopes and dreams for college, and a white child who's denied admission into a school is just as upset as a black child, and so we shouldn't use race to make these admission decisions. Right? Blue lives, black lives matter, taxes, all sorts of these things, they all come down to kind of understanding of victimization. Well,
and one of the things that you talk about in the book that I like because I see it so much and it drives me a little nuts is that people will tell you that the way to convince them that the other side is right or to change their mind is, if you show me facts, I will, that's the thing that, what would make you change your mind? Facts. But then you give them facts and they say, those are fake facts. And so the facts aren't actually compelling to get people to change their mind. And I see this a lot, and I'm sure both sides are guilty of this, but I feel like I see it more on the left, maybe just because I live here, that there's a lot of this, like, I'm going to meet people's feelings or people's beliefs with statistics. And it's just such a faceplant every time. I mean, it's just like, well, if you look at this and carry the one and no one cares about that. Like, people feel a certain way about crime or the economy or whatever. And then, to bring out the PowerPoint, it's just not helpful. But you actually cite to studies that show that is actually, despite what people say, not the most compelling way to get them to bridge.
That's right. So when we asked a representative sample of Americans, what do you want in moral conversations to build respect? They say facts. And then, as you say, we're like, here are the facts. They're like, not those facts. Those are not the facts I'm looking for. Because, we live in different environments of what a fact is, but also we can disagree about which facts are relevant. And so in this series of studies, we looked a lot about the argument about guns, right? And you're like, well, this is how many times that guns have been used to, kill people. And then pro-gun rights folks are like, well, those are not reasonable facts because those are people who are not using guns correctly. And they're also not showcasing how guns can be used properly in self-defense, right? Like appropriate gun ownership. And they're not like taking into account the mental health crisis that's like really driving the kind of like, so right, you can kind of like go into your own facts all the time. And it's certainly true that it doesn't work, right? So I want like you to think about a conversation like arguing about immigration or abortion or guns. And then someone was like, oh, hey, I heard this thing on Fox News and you haven't heard it before and here it is. And then you're like, oh my goodness, thank you for disabusing of my deeply held view of this moral issue, right? Like, I guess I'm wrong. But like, it's same on the opposite side. You're like, I got a zinger from NPR. This is gonna nail it, and then it never, ever happens. And that's because not only do we have different facts, but just our minds do not work this. I try to teach students statistics. It is really hard to teach statistics because our minds do not work that way. Instead, they work for storytelling, right? Our minds evolved to tell stories. Like you can tell a 2-year-old a story and they will get it. And so it turns out that the way to bridge divides and build respect, at least initially, facts still matter, is to start with stories. So with guns, for instance, the study we ran is we paired people up and they either had a conversation where the pro-gun rights person would say, look, handguns are used over 100,000 times every year in self-defense, or one night, someone broke into our house and my mom used her handgun to defend our family. That story, even though it's just an anecdote, commands much more respect than a statistic, not only because it's personal, and which makes it seem truer than a statistic, but also because it makes the other person seem rational. We understand how people want to avoid harm, even if we disagree about the kind of statistical truth of those harms, right? And so it's really storytelling, especially involving harm, that helps to bridge that divide initially.
And I love this approach because you hear about, and I'm from the South, as people who come to the Commonwealth Club regularly know, I talk about it all the time. As a Southerner, and I feel like I've sort of got feet in both worlds, but I hear my friends here talk about how, why do people vote against their interest? And it just makes me so crazy because no one votes against their own interest. It's just you haven't figured out what the harm is they're trying to avoid and why that's more important to them than whatever you think the harm is going to be to them based on who they're voting for. But I think this whole idea of an objective harm versus trying to understand what other people are really, what's most important to them. Exactly.
So if you are a kind of, I don't know, reasonably wealthy progressive in an urban environment, right? It maybe is not super obvious to you. And I have family in Nebraska, fairly rural, right? They have strong interests and a perspective that might not align as well. And so again, if you understand kind of where they're coming from, the assumptions they're making about how the world works, then you can understand their moral judgments. Right, and not sit there and go, I just don't understand. Like, we have to educate them. Yeah, although, there is kind of statistical truths. Mm-hmm. So I often think about this of like people voting against higher taxes And it's not, it just like people would generally be better off having higher taxes unless you're super wealthy.
So Canadian.
Is the argument. I am Canadian, but I just think, and by the way, I like in America that like you get to keep more of your money and work harder. I do really like that about America. But, having a handful of billionaires who have like so much money, I'm like, you could just tax billionaires a little bit and that's probably better off. Maybe this is an unpopular opinion in the land of tech, but for the most people, right, I feel like they would explicitly think that. But I think for reasons, the harm that they see, they think it's better for the country, right? It's like more entrepreneurial spirit, right? So I think
it's more like we don't trust that the government is doing the right thing with the money they have, much less
there we go.
The whatever they would get from the billionaires.
There we go.
Feeding the machine is not what they're interested in.
So that's exactly right? Like egghead Canadians, like, well, shouldn't we have like maybe a little higher taxes? And then you're like, well, I don't trust the government. And so that's a perfect example of like not voting against your self-interest.
Right. Well, exactly. But but people go, oh, well, then why are you bumpkins voting against your self-interest?
Totally.
They're definitely not. No one ever is.
Right.
So in the end, you talk about how we can bridge the divide by telling each other stories. But how do you even get in the door? I mean, to tell someone your story, you have to listen to them. It means, switching from Fox to MSNBC or something like that. I mean, how do you even sort of have those conversations?
Yeah, it's hard. And it's hard, because we're like feeling like prey. It can be hard to open yourself up to someone who you're worried is going to attack you, even if only conversationally. And so I think the step to do that is really, I have a little guide in the book, but I think the first thing you can do is kind of like connect with someone and not talk directly about politics. Like if you sit down with someone and you're like, hey, how'd you vote that way? Like obviously they're going to bristle and they're going to say something nasty to you. But there's so much more you could have in common with someone, right? You could talk about food, you could talk about music, you could talk about pets, you could talk about whatever, like you could talk about 100 things. And it doesn't have to start with politics. So once you get to know someone, and you can do that by asking questions, people vastly underestimate how much they like being asked questions, especially deep questions. Tell me, how do you think you're going to die? Tell me, when's the last time you cried?
Choking on a pizza, probably.
Yeah, when's the last time you cried?
Jesus Christ. You will get kicked off Muni if you try that.
I know, but it turns out if you randomly assign people to have these conversations on the train into work, this is a Chicago study, you're on the train into work and you're like, you should ask people these questions. You're looking at me like I'm crazy. But turns out people love having these conversations. They love having real connection because you're like, pretty cold out there, that rain, hey? You're like, yeah, it's rainy. But if I'm like, yeah, it's rainy out there and like, do you feel hope today? Or like, when's the last time like you thought of your first pet? And like, I don't know, whatever, right? These like deep, like people like having this connection. And then once you connect with someone and you listen to them, boy, now when you invite them to share their politics and you invite kindly for understanding, I know we voted differently, right? I know you're kind of anti-redistribution, and I'm just really interested in learning that because I grew up in Canada. It's different there. I know you grew up in the South. And so I just love to hear how your experiences growing up shaped your kind of reality and how they might be different than mine, right? But if you're not willing to share, that's fine, but I'd love to hear. Right? And so now that we've connected over the fact that she has 3 older brothers that she's not attracted to, and
that's my stop. I gotta get off the train now.
and the invitation to share politics, now when you share politics, now I can be like, oh, I get that. I understand. Thank you for sharing. Right? Now you can have these conversations a little better because you recognize where you're at personally and kind of like the roots of those discussions.
But isn't there sort of an intrinsic limit here? Because there are people who at least think that they know what the other side's harm is, and they just go, well, I don't care. Your harm is, my harm is mine, so it's obviously better. And your harm is yours, and I don't think that it's as important. I feel like my victim status or my potential pain is greater than yours or more likely than yours. And so it's not the case that I don't know where you're coming from. It's just that I think you're crazy, and I think my harm is better.
Yes, and people do that, and that's just part of having moral convictions, right? That your harm is kind of more real or more important than the other person's harm, right? That's what it means to have a moral difference, because our morals are driven by our perceptions of harm. But even if you hold fast to those convictions, you can still meet someone where they're at if you think that you're not 100% correct, but just 99. Like that 1% can make all the difference, right? I can say, look, I think, I wouldn't say I think you're not right, but I could listen to you and understand you and validate your feelings, and then maybe suggest something different, right? But you have to do that initial listening and validation first to even have an attempt to get someone to move closer to you.
But I think that what's important here is that also includes you having, in our imaginary scenario, having the humility to really be listening and not just waiting to like debate me, let me get your childhood story and then I can tell you how you're wrong.
Your childhood sucked.
Which I feel like is, I've definitely seen, or I have a coworker who's showing me these texts with a family member, and it was just so obvious that one person was just pretending to listen. Tell me more about why you think they're at this flat. It just so they could have, sort of try to convince them otherwise, versus really being open to others' ideas. I feel like your next book should be called Humility. And that,
it ends with that, a little moral humility.
But I feel like that is something that people are missing, and maybe it is a function of the fact that it does feel like it comes from so deep. Why would you question that? How could you question that?
Right.
In something that seems so natural and normal.
Yes. And right, we all have this impulse to think our morals are true and that other people's morals who disagree are not true. And it is hard to listen, but it is a skill you can learn. And I think it's a skill that really pays dividends, and I think brings people closer to you if you actually do it. And so I have this story, since stories help convince folks. I took an Uber to the airport some time ago, and I get in the car, and he says, what do you do? And I say, I'm a social psychologist. What do you social psychology? And I say, I study morality and politics. And he says, all right, well, here's what I think.
Oh, boy.
Here we go, like, hold my beer.
This is an SNL sketch, I think.
Yeah. And he says, I'm a Christian nationalist, but not the typical kind. That's what I think. And I say, okay, I've never met a Christian nationalist, let alone an atypical one, and I'm really excited to learn kind of what you think. And so for 20 minutes, I asked him questions. Like, what do you think about this? And he told me about what he thinks about the role of the state and the church and the family and how those things intertwine, and like what it means to like worship in the public square and all sorts of things, right? I just really wanted to get into his ideology and understand like what was going on there. So I wasn't like just holding my breath until I could jump on him, but I was just trying to understand, right? Maybe a Canadian kind of opens me up, like there's so much about America I don't know, like atypical Christian nationalism. And so at the end of this conversation, well, close to the end, we're driving up to the airport and we start talking about abortion because we wanted to make it more contentious. And, he's clearly pro-life, and he starts saying, well, I don't understand how you could be pro-choice, because that seems like you're basically just like, throwing your lot in with the Gestapo. Right, it takes like people no time to like link the opposite moral side to the Nazis. It's like a law on the internet, Godwin's law. The longer conversations happen about morality, the likelihood that someone mentions Hitler reaches 100%. But so I teach a class on how to have civil moral disagreement. I randomly assign students to different topics about abortion or taxation or immigration, whatever. Like there's reasonable people on each side of those issues having clear convictions. And I'm like, look, we can't have a conversation about this if you're going to compare half of America to the Nazis. It's just not acceptable. We can't do this, right? I teach this class, and we set ground rules, and we can't do this, right? Because you can have a legitimate perception on each side of the issue. And what he says is, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have done it. It was hard for me to put it into words. What I meant to say was, and then he basically articulates a slippery slope argument, that if you don't respect the sanctity of fetal life, it'll lead you to not respect the sanctity of other kinds of life, including children, and then will lead to bad things like death camps. Okay, but slippery slope arguments are a reasonable philosophical argument. And yet, right, he apologized. And I don't know, you think back to any moral conversations that you had, there's not a lot of apologies and not a lot of people saying, I take it back, I'm sorry, you're right. Right? But he did this because I listened for 20 minutes and because I genuinely wanted to know what he was thinking. And at the end of the conversation, he said, thank you, or I really appreciate it. I think I understand more a little bit now about pro-choice positions or whatever, right? Articulating these positions. So no one left convinced of the other side or thought they were wrong, but everyone left having more respect for their side. And I know, right, that he went home and kind of carried that with him. So I think it's that's a good thing, right? You listen, and not only do you understand, but they come closer to your position.
Wow, 5 stars. For that,
I did give him 5 stars. That's right.
Did he give you 5 stars? Is the question. Okay, we have some audience questions here. Alrighty. Oh, okay. Well, we covered this a bit, but we can get into a little more detail because there's a handy guide in the book. What strategies would you recommend for teaching the skills of active listening, reflective feedback, and validation of others' feelings?
Great question. So in the book, I work with a bunch of practitioners who are out there kind of actively bridging divides. One of these practitioners, his name is John Saruf, and he's been bridging communities and fractured families, in a sense, for decades. And I called him one day, and he's a friend of mine, and I say, John, give me 3 tips to heal America. And he refused, but he did tell me, general tips about conversations, and they are, I put them together as CIV, CIV, the start of more civil conversations. And so the kind of active listening a little bit is like the connecting, right? You're trying to connect with them as a human being without politics. And it's actually pretty easy to connect with someone if you're not thinking about politics and you just want to learn about who they are, right? So you can active listen, right? Oh yeah, wow. Mm-hmm. And then invite, right? You can invite someone to share their beliefs, not force them, and then validate. And I think validation is where a lot of this active listening, where the rubber hits the road. Like someone tells you something that's a little offensive, talking about abortion, they say Gestapo or baby killer. And you kind of say, okay, I understand you're really feeling powerfully about kind of protecting fetal rights and fetal lives, and I get that. But likening people to the Nazis might not really be the best strategy for building civil discourse, So, but you can validate someone's opinion without agreeing with it, and I think this is where it's hard when it comes to bridging divides and having these conversations. And one example I want to bring up is a gentleman named Daryl Davis. So oftentimes when I bring up these conversations, people are like, well, should I really have a conversation with someone who I think is evil, right? Or someone who is against someone of a different race or against the fact that, women should have the same rights as men or something, right? Should I have to have these conversations? And the answer is always no, you shouldn't have to have these conversations. But Daryl Davis is a black man, a blues musician who's made it his life work to talk to KKK members and encourage them to give up their robes. And in the course of his career doing this, he's encouraged hundreds of folks whose ideology is not only odious, but is directly targeted against Mr. Davis. And he's been successful, right, because he listens and because he can kind of actively validate people's concerns without agreeing with them. And so it's hard, but it's possible. And not that we all have to be Daryl Davis, but next time you're talking to your uncle who voted for someone different, or your coworker who likes to listen to AM radio, you can think about Daryl Davis talking to KKK members, and it might situate it a little bit. I could listen to this guy at the water cooler and say, I kind of understand where you're coming from, and listen a bit.
Alrighty. We've got, I understand you began your career in geophysics before transitioning to social psychology. Somebody's Googling you.
Yeah, wow, nice.
Geophysics, okay. What sparked your interest in political psychology and morality, and what motivated you to refocus your research in this direction?
Well, there's the neat narrative that I say is what turned me away from geophysics was being stalked by lynx in the Canadian North. And so that story is in the book, made me realize that humans are indeed prey, as I was basically cold and defenseless in the almost Arctic when a storm left us there. So, but I think another answer is that rocks are pretty boring. And
the
people
truth
are
comes
not.
out.
Yeah, people are very interesting. And what really got me interested in what I study, which is morality and politics and religion and how we make sense of the minds of others, is that these things are ultimately invisible. Like geophysics, like there's a there. If you just dig down, you're going to find something eventually. There's going to be some rocks, maybe some oil if you're lucky, some natural gas. That's what I was looking for in the Canadian North. But like morality, religion, like these aren't things you can hold in your hands, and yet they're so important. People live and die and kill, right, for these things. And I wanted to understand what those were in our mind.
But they are connected to at least geography, right? I mean, you do talk about, for example, Japan, and the way our societies form is often based on the way sort of the land sits, right? Are you in an agrarian place? Are you in a place with lots of mountains? Are you in a place where there's lots of earthquakes? I mean, that tells us what's important and how we sort of manage our group.
Yeah, it's a great point. So our collective moral sense stems from our environments in a big way, and especially the threats that we face, right? Because again, we're focused on kind of harm. And if you live in a place that's often threatened, so like Japan from earthquakes, right? Those cultures tend to be what's called tighter, right? You have to follow the rules better, because if there's a tsunami coming and you hear the sirens and like, everyone go, and you're like, yeah, let me think about it.
False flag.
Let me do my own thing. I need to have a cigarette and just like consider it. Then it's bad news, right? Everyone has to work. You have to build the sandbags together, right? You have to all come together as a society. Or if there's famines, right? You need to cooperate and you need to pool food and make sure that people share accordingly. But if we live in America, land of plenty, especially in the kind of Midwest where there's fewer natural disasters, people are much more individualistic, not in a bad way, but kind of just like more into liberty, more into freedom, right? Because you can do that, So it depends where you live.
But do you use that to inform the way you view the world, or have you just completely put the geophysics in the rearview mirror?
Oh, no. So geography definitely matters. But I think the precise resistivity of certain strata at different depths, left that behind.
Okay, we have another question here. And I do want to get to this because you talk in the book a decent amount about victimhood and how we can cast ourselves as victims, how we see others as victims, and importantly, and I'm so glad you made the connection here, between that and responsibility. Because I think that really does inform a lot of how people assess victimhood, right? I think in people's minds it's not separate, right? That if you ask me like who rank the victims, I'm not just thinking like who could stand in the middle of a field and be in trouble. I'm thinking in context who's as responsible for their actions. I think you talk about an axis, I think, in the book, but it's important to have both, right?
Yeah, I mean, so the kind of general phenomena that I think is useful for folks is something called moral typecasting. So if you think about typecasting in Hollywood, I often think of like Daniel Radcliffe. He's a good example. If you saw that dude on the street, you'd be like, Harry Potter, right? You wouldn't think Daniel Radcliffe, right? And so we typecast actors in enduring roles, and we typecast other people into enduring moral roles. And there's really two moral roles that people are concerned about. There's victimhood, and then there's the perpetrator, right? There's like pain, and there's blame. And in our mind, these things are generally separate. And so once we're convinced that someone's in like the pain role, we don't think of them as being blamed, right? If like someone's an orphan who's been abused, and then they do something bad, like murder their stepmom or something. That's an example I talk about in the book. People are like, yeah, that checks out. That's okay, right? He was abused. That makes sense, right? I'm not going to blame him. But if you're a villain, then no one thinks of your inner pain, right? If you're a bad person and then you're like crying, people are like, whatever, like stop crying. You don't really suffer. And so like Harvey Weinstein, right, who everyone agrees is like a massive villain, right? He comes into court, with like a cane and shuffling and like, oh, I'm in pain. And everyone's like, come on, man. Like, we're not buying it for 1 second, right? And so we really have these two different camps. And so with these clear villains and victims, right, it makes sense. So you've got like Hitler and you've got orphans, okay. But you do this in your daily life too, right? If you like see someone and you're convinced they're a villain, you ignore their pain. And if you see someone and you're convinced they're a victim, then you think they're not responsible for anything they do.
Well, and so the implications for that, though, can be can be, I think, serious in terms of how people perceive harm, right? Like, what happens if this whole group of people gets to be not responsible for what they do, and how does that impact me, and in that sense is a perceived harm as well.
That's right. So you can strip away someone's responsibility. I think in large part, a lot of political disagreements about some folks really hinge on, like, are these people victims or are these people responsible for their plight? And in some sense, like villains in a sense, right? So it often comes up, is often studied in social psychology about victims of sexual assault or people from disadvantaged racial groups, right? Some folks would be like, look, they've suffered so much, right? They're clearly victims. And then other people were like, well, but are they responsible for their victimization? And so they're not victims at all, right? This is a kind of like competition of like who gets to say who is a victim in society, and it drives opinions on these moral issues.
And what was the Victim Olympics was the characterization of social media.
That's right. That's right. And so the interesting thing about social media is, like, it's so decontextualized, right? You're like arguing with strangers that you've never seen and you'll never see their faces about issues that are like far away and national for the most part. And there we need a common currency that we can all understand so we can try to one up each other. And it turns out we all understand victimhood because it's like so deep and innate in our minds. And so this is why everyone talks about victimhood and everyone tries to be more of a victim on social media because, right, that's what commands respect and our attention.
I have a question here from the audience. It says, conversations are a great starting point, but the duration of openness or good feelings appears to be fairly short. What recommendations do you have for the longer term effects of openness?
Yeah, right. And like good feelings are not enough, obviously. But you can like leverage those feelings into more action. So I know that there are, I think Convergence is the nonprofit that does this. So it gets lawmakers together in a space where they can first build relationship, exchange stories, and then can focus on more policy-based issues. And so one successful example of an organization like this got Republicans and Democrat lawmakers together to address an issue in healthcare that everyone cares about. And it's not like, should we axe Obamacare or not, have a single-payer healthcare system? It was about emergency medical billing. Everyone agrees, left and right, that you shouldn't go bankrupt because your kid breaks his arm. But how do you get these folks together to have this conversation when they're like so far apart and bipartisanism seems so bad to so many people in political parties? Well, you get them together in secret often, and then they tell stories, they connect, right? They build kind of like these good feelings, and then they can get to work, actually addressing problems. So it's possible.
John Marshall made the U.S. Supreme Court live together.
Yeah.
The original Supreme Court. I feel like I just want to spend 5 minutes on the wall in that dorm, but it helped to, he always said it helped to make sure they had unanimous decisions as often as possible.
Right, and Congress now, it doesn't stay in D.C., right? Everyone goes back to their home constituencies, and so it makes it hard to kind of like build these kind of bipartisan support.
Well, and so this ties into this question. How can policymakers and leaders effectively use insights from this moral psychology to craft policies that resonate across the political spectrum and address the concerns of diverse groups? And I would assume it would look something like, making sure you're addressing the perceived harm. And if there's a way to address both sides, if it's possible, perceived harms, like I'm going to do this, but I'm also going to allow this exception to sort of address this other issue, maybe one way to think about that?
I think that's exactly right. And I think even sharing these stories of harm initially gives lawmakers and the general public a sense of like actually how complicated the issue is. So I was talking to some attorneys down in Texas who were, thinking about immigration and long-term policy. And, I'm obviously as a Canadian, like pro-immigration and like yay dreamers. But then, she's recounting a story from some ranchers along the border. And she says that, these families have to keep their lights off at night because as folks come up the border and like coyotes are bringing folks and they're starving, right? And there are some kind of criminal folks, some cartel folks, right? They see the lights and they kind of like rush to the house, and he and his wife and his kids are awoken with just people banging on their door. And that's terrifying, right? And so now that I understand that that's the kind of experience of ranchers along the border, and like there's certainly fewer ranchers than I think there are kind of undocumented immigrants in America all told. But I think having a policy that also kind of protects those folks who, are trying to do their best on that land, I think makes more sense to me now. So I think sharing those stories is helpful.
I think people would be surprised at doing legislative research, like how little lawmakers survey interested parties. It's often just like who's here, who's at the Capitol, who's got a lobbyist to find, instead of saying, okay, what actually is happening, or really being curious about people's lived experiences, or maybe not surprised. I don't know. Okay, this one person says, and this is, I think, the main question that everyone is here to learn. What is your best piece of advice for dealing with a family member whose convictions are very different from our own, especially if it feels really difficult to listen and understand one another?
Yeah, it's a great question. And part of what motivated me to write this book as well, right? So I have family in Nebraska. And as a kid, it was clear we had everything in common because we liked riding horses and swimming in the pond. But then as we got older, it was clear we disagreed about some core issues. And sometimes folks were open for conversation and sometimes folks were not. And I think, the tips I talked about, like connecting, inviting, validating, I think those go a long way. Sometimes people are just looking for a fight, though, as well. There's a gin for conflict. And so what do you do with those folks? I don't do a lot with those folks. I talk about other things, right? So I'm very happy to listen and build dialogue and connect about politics and contentious issues with folks who are willing to afford me the same grace that I do them. Or not even the same grace, some grace. And a little bit of listening, and I understand that maybe I'm more motivated or our practice is more fine. But if someone is just not, and they're just looking to throw talking points at you, then I think you can still talk to them about lots of things, just not about politics. And there are more important things in politics. Last time I went to Nebraska was for a funeral. And my cousin, he passed away, and we didn't talk about politics hardly at all. Right? We talked about his life and, his family and so forth. So I think if they're family, there are other things that bind you. And if there's not other things that bind you and it's only just about yelling about politics every Thanksgiving or Christmas, then I don't know, maybe you should reevaluate who's in your family. I'm not saying you should just take grief for your whole life. I'm not saying you should be a doormat, but I'm saying you should try constructively. And I think you're maybe, and this is a generalization, people are not asking as receptive questions as they think. So I got an email from someone in Western Australia who read the book and was doing the work, and I was really pleased. She was like, "Oh, I had this conversation with my neighbor. He's kind of a Trumper. Even it's Western Australia. I guess there's Trumpers there too, in Perth."
I think we're going to annex it soon. Don't worry.
That's right. And I really respect how she was trying really hard to understand his perspective and listening. But her initial question, and then we're talking about, Israel and Gaza, which is a double black diamond, when it comes to navigating the slopes of political disagreement a little bit. And she said, yeah, I'm wondering if you could tell me how you can make sense of all the civilian deaths on the side of the Palestinians. And it's it's a fair question, but it's not a question that's going to provide a lot of openness and willingness to kind of share your personal feeling, right? Because it says there's a harm, justify how you are willing to engage in it or at least be complicit in it. And so, right, I think if you genuinely want to have this conversation with this family member, you can kind of ask more questions about their personal experiences, and then when they say something offensive, you can just grit your teeth a little bit and be like, oh, I understand how you feel that way about it, but maybe that blah, 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 right? So you can kind of validate and move the conversation a little bit slowly, but you don't have to if it's so terrible that it makes you want to quit.
Well, it is interesting because what you talk about was somebody just looking to pick a fight, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes they are. And there's something narcissistic about certain people's victimhood, right? That they're out to get me. And it's like, no one's out to get you. Like,
Right.
You're not important enough. I'll just be honest.
Right.
And you want to say that sometimes, but is that inevitable? I mean, like, are we, as a society, how do you even try to come back from this idea of like victimhood as a currency, victimhood as a way to get attention, and as a, you know, sort of the highest good? And is there an answer for that, or hope that we would get to a different place where that's not necessarily like the highest thing? Or is that part of that system one requirement that we have?
I think it's part of who we are. I think part of who we are is worrying about suffering. It's worrying about the vulnerable people. But I think in large part, that's a good thing, because if we're worrying about the suffering of people, right, then we get kind of moral progress, right? We worry about the suffering of people who look different than us, people who, you know, live in different countries. We worry about the suffering of animals, which people didn't do 200 years ago at all. Right? So the fact that people put dogs on their sweater now is a testament to the fact that, like, perceptions of harm and concerns about suffering, right, have led people to be kinder and more compassionate. But I think, again, we need to make sure that doesn't run so rampant that now we're arguing about who's the truest victim, right? It's about authentically having compassion for concerns about harm and not just using it superficially to win points on the internet.
Well, and I think that leads us to a happy note that we can try to end on, as we're running out of time here. And that is this idea that we're actually in many ways safer than we've ever been. We've got healthier than we've been. And so, but our minds, though, because we are so programmed to seek, to sort of be vigilant, I'll say that, sort of keep finding harms. And so it actually is some ways just a biological function. Maybe take a step back and remember that we are, there's almost no other time in human history when it would be better to be alive.
That's right. I mean, if you had to pick a time to be born, it's like probably around nowish, right, is the best time to be born in all of human history, right? Because we have amazing medical care, because we have robot cars that can drive you around, as I'm learning in San Francisco, right? We have all sorts of great things right now. We have relatively more equality. And I think, we do get outraged about what people say on social media, but imagine you went back 150 years ago when children worked in factories and parents are worried about their kids coming home alive or their kids coming home with all their limbs. And you told these parents, you know what the biggest problem is in 150 years from now? People say nasty things on the internet, and it makes other people real angry. They would say, like, okay, well, I hope my kid comes home with their hands.
You say, what's the internet?
And so clearly,
what's a peanut allergy?
These are real concerns about kind of justice and outrage and, the internet today. And I'm not trying to minimize those things, but I'm saying it is kind of a luxury that we get to worry about these things because we do have things like child labor laws and we do have things like seatbelts, right? And so I think the good note is we've made so much progress and there's relatively more equality than there used to be, although there's always room to, improve, obviously. But I think it can put it in perspective.
Excellent. Well, with that, we are at time. We need to wrap it up. So thanks, everyone, for coming tonight. We encourage you to support the club's efforts, making virtual and in-person programming possible by becoming a member. For more information, visit commonwealthclub.org. And once again, many thanks to the Civic Health Project for supporting tonight's program. We also encourage you to pick up a copy of Outraged, either here or at your local bookstore. And of course, many thanks. Big round of applause for Dr. Kurt Gray.